Okay, we're ready to rock and roll, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Tom's Talmud TISCH. Today, we are focusing on Pesach. And before we begin with tonight's content, I just want to gratefully acknowledge our sponsorship. Today's sponsors are Eliezer and Esther Sheffer in Elad, to honor the recently observed yahrzeit of their son and brother, Arik ben Eliezer. It's the Neshama should have an Aliyah, Fa'ala Yidin Ayeshia. Should only be good things. And wish you Arichas Yamim V'Shanim Tevis. Amen. Okay, Rabbi Sai. So, today, just ask, is the Gemara on the Mishna that we learned in the previous episode. It happens to be we learned the previous episode a long time ago, like a year ago. But we're back in the swing of things, and we're learning the Gemara. Now, I just want to take a moment to say something about Mishna and Gemara. So the Mishna is concise. It gives you like a case and a ruling. Maybe sometimes it won't just give a ruling, sometimes it's giving a number of rulings, like different opinions. And there's a variety of reasons as to why we have to include all the different opinions. On the simplest of levels, somebody might come along someday and say, well, why wouldn't we say such and such? And the answer will be, this was considered. How do we know? Because the Mishnah documents that there was a consideration of that approach, and for whatever reason it was rejected. That's not the halacha. And in this way, we have the range of the different opinions. But the Mishnah doesn't really give us the deeper understanding of the jurisprudence or the inner workings, or the theory and legal philosophy of the halacha. It just tells what the halacha is. But the Gemara has a marvelous way of analyzing the Mishnah, sometimes by virtue of charitable analysis, by kind of zeroing in on the precise language or syntax that the Mishnah uses. Sometimes it is by offering or contrasting the teachings that were preserved in a separate document, a karasa to the Mishnah. This is known as Beraisa. So when we have the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is not clear, and then we have Beraisa, so by virtue of comparing Mishnah and Beraisa, so the Beraisa becomes the fuller explanation of the Mishnah. And both of these together is called the Talmud. The Mishnah and the Gemara together is called the Talmud. Now, sometimes in order to learn a Mishnah, you have to have a great deal of information. And without having information, the Mishnah doesn't seem to really make a lot of sense to us. So I shared a fair deal of information when we taught this Mishnah previously. And some of that information I'm going to repeat, because most of you don't remember from a year ago. Or maybe some of you are joining online and never heard that class. I'm going to do a bit of repetition invariably about the background and about the deeper understanding, but this is really, in a certain sense, only available and possible because of the analysis of the Gemara. So in the Mishnah, we were talking about the proceedings of the Seder. And the first cup of wine is poured, and Kiddush is recited, and we begin the Seder. Everything's fantastic, and we go through Kaddish and do Urchatz, and then we do Yachatz. So we have Karpas, and we have the vegetable, and then we break the matzah. And then at that point, the matzah, or the bread, is pushed aside, and we fill a second glass, and the Mishnah said, V'kan, and at this point, Haben Shoel Aviv, then the child asks the father. So this is how we create the curiosity amongst the child. And when the child is curious, here's a Gemara. When the child is curious, so what happens is the child starts asking questions. And then we're going to answer the questions. And that's how we're going to fulfill, ostensibly, the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. But the bigger question, which the Mishnah didn't really explain to us in any way, shape, or form, is why was it so important to get the child to ask the question? Like the Mishnah says, you pour that second glass of wine and the child's going to ask. And in our class, in our previous episode, and everybody's welcome to go back and watch it, we talked about the variety of unusual things that are done up until this point, and this becomes the third thing. And because it's the third thing, a child's looking at what's going on over here. That's strike one, strike two, strike three. Something is off, something's out. What's going on? So the child starts asking questions. And it's clearly important for us to stimulate the child. We want the child to be curious. We want the child to ask questions. It's important to us. It somehow is an integral part of the proceeding of the Seder. But the question is why? And the Mishna, whilst it listed the various questions, did not explain to us why it was important to have questions being asked to begin with. We even heard about the responsibility, the obligation of the parents who are going to now teach the child and how they have to teach the child. Well, why do we have to have this question altogether? And what happens if there's no child to ask questions? Could be such a thing. What if you're sitting yourself at a Seder? What if you're two elderly people at a Seder? Like, how does that work? Is it an obligation? Do you have to have a child at a Seder? Kidnap a child and put him to a Seder because you have to have a child? It's not a good idea, right? So we don't have clarity. The Mishnah didn't explain this. The Mishnah simply told us, here are the proceedings. You pour another glass of wine, and at this point the child interjects, and he's going to ask the questions. He doesn't ask the questions, teach him to ask the questions. What are the questions? Here are the questions. And then we talk about the kind of response that we're going to begin with shameful, a shameful opening, but it's going to end in a glorious way. We're not going to talk about the Masechet Begnus and Messiah Meshevach. We're not going to talk about that today. That's going to be, with Hashem's help, that will be in our next episode. In this class, in this episode, we're going to focus on two things. The first thing is the business of asking. Like we need to ask. Who has to ask? When do they have to ask? Why do they have to ask? Does it have to be a child? That's going to be question one. And then the other question, we're going to talk about one of the four proverbial questions which we kind of feed the child or stimulate the curious child to ask. And they're not mutually exclusive, you'll see. They're not two subjects. They actually kind of flow. One flows into the other, as you will see. So let's begin with the Gemara. We're on Daf Kuf Tez Zayin. We're on page 116, side A. We have learned the Mishnah. This is smack in the middle of the page. And after the Mishnah comes the words Gimel Mem, and that means Gemara. And we are beginning to analyze the teachings of the Mishnah. Now, I want to point out to you that oftentimes we have Rashi who will comment on the entirety of the Gemara. In the 10th chapter of Masechet Pesachim, Rashi does not always comment on everything, and as such, when they printed the Talmud, Rashi's grandson, Rashbam, is also included, although very, very often he'll say verbatim what Rashi's saying or add maybe a word or two. There are certain parts of the Gemara which Rashi did not explain at all. Today's Gemara does not have any Rashi explanation, but it does have Rashbam explanation, which is important for you to know. Somebody asked me how he's going to master all these nuances of the Gemara and the Mishnah, and Rashi and Rashbam and all the different commentaries. You know what I told him? What do you think I told him, Eliezer? I said, just start learning. That's all. Just start learning. See, Dimitri knows me already. Just start learning. Mm-hmm. The more you learn, the more familiar you become with these things. It's like there's really very little point to just memorizing all the different commentaries, who they are. Or just learn. If you learn, you know. Okay. So the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanon. Now the words Tanu Rabbanon, or in acronym form, which are Taf Reish, Tanu Rabbanon tells us that this is a Braisa. Things like Ditanya, for we learned, or Tanu Rabbanon is always going to indicate that this is a Braisa. So this is a Braisa here. And in our Braisa, we learned Chacham Beno, if the child is clever enough, quick enough, I guess you would call him smart enough. It doesn't say Navon Bno. It doesn't say he's an understanding. He doesn't have to be a very deep thinker. He doesn't say he's a Yadan. He's literate and knowledgeable and educated. All he has to be to ask a question is a Chacham. You just have to be clever. You just have to be able to look at the situation and say, hey, what's going on over here? You don't have to have knowledge to ask a question. You have to be clever. You have to be able to process what's going on. You don't have to think deeply. You see something and it's out of sorts. So if you're clever enough, you're going to ask the question. So what if you have a clever son or a smart kid? Show Allah. Then he asks. What if he's Meino Chacham? What if he's not smart? He's not clever. He doesn't really get it. So it's self-understood that sometimes the clever child is so clever that on his own the child will ask. And sometimes the child is not so clever, so maybe you have to prompt him. I think the Gemara doesn't analyze that. The Brisa doesn't talk about what if he's not so smart to think by himself, then prompt him. It's self-understood. Either he'll ask the question, or you prompt the question. But what if you're prompting the question and the kid's not asking? He's like, I don't know. What's the problem? It's fine. Well, didn't you notice something unusual tonight? I don't know. It's all the same to me. I didn't notice. Now we have a problem. Now, the Gemara could just have easily have said, what if there's no child at the table? The Brisa could have said, Ein ben, there's no child. It's possible. I mean, there are people who have Seder Seder without a child present. What happens if there's no child? So I think that this is a bigger chiddush. This is a greater novelty. Not only is this the case if there's no child, but if you have a child who isn't asking the question. He's not asking. So should you feed words into his mouth? He's not asking the question.
It's referring to a specific question here.
It is referring.
Not asking any question?
Well, it is referring to a specific question, but we kind of fed the child the questions because we're doing things which are markedly different because we want the child to respond. We want him to ask questions. So if you do something in a particular way all the time, and then on one evening it looks kind of the same, but it's very different, a clever child's going to say, what's going on here? Something is different tonight than it is a whole year. Now, you may argue that the child remembers this from year to year, but that's not really true. It's not really true. Sometimes children in their early years, they have an experience, and they forget it by next year. And then they only remember what happened recently. They remember what happened a year ago. And then at a certain point, their memory library starts to build up. I know this is true, and I'll tell you a little story from my childhood that how I know this is true. When I was a boy, I think this is 1979, I think 78 or 79, I'm not 100% sure, but this is verifiable. It's not hard to find out the answer to this question. We always would spend Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with the Rebbe. It was always the case. My parents, regardless where we lived in a variety of places up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. We always went to New York, stayed by my grandparents, and we were by the Rebbe. Okay? I have no memory of ever being anywhere else Yom Kippur, or ever anywhere else Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe, at the end of Yom Kippur, for many, many years, they would begin to sing a particular song, which is called Napoleon's March, and that's a story in and of itself. And the Rebbe would encourage the singing in a very intense way. And it was different. The Rebbe would encourage singing all the time. And he would, kind of, with a great enthusiasm, he would inject passion and fervor and joy and intensity into the atmosphere, create an electric atmosphere around him. That was all the time, but it was something very unique. In the night of Yom Kippur, at the end of Yom Kippur, remember it's 26 hours, 26 hours, everybody's fasting, everybody's praying the whole day. In every shul, it's special the end of Yom Kippur. You can imagine what it was like in the Rebbe's shul. And the singing would reach a fever pitch, and then the Rebbe used to climb on his chair. The Rebbe used to climb on his chair, which was not like a sturdy chair. It's like a chair with velvet padding, and he would climb in a chair, and he would literally have to balance himself. And the Rebbe was vigorously encouraging the singing in a very vigorous, intense way. And it was remarkable. The Rebbe would throw his talis over, and his talis was like sometimes falling off. And I remember one year I could see clearly that the whole front of the talis was stained with tears. I could see it clearly. I very vividly remember these things. But so I remember the first time I remember it. And it's funny, why would I remember it from the year before? It happened every year. I don't know. So when is the first time? Was I 8 years old? Was I 9 years old? I don't remember. This, like I said, is verifiable, and I'll tell you why it's so verifiable. Because I couldn't believe it. I said, wow, he got up on this chair. And I'm watching the Rebbe on the chair. But I don't remember that from last year. Why not? Because that's how it is with kids. At a certain point, you don't remember from year to year. And then, what happened is, I was so excited. A whole year, I was looking forward to seeing it again. And then I came to Shul, and that's why I say it's verifiable which year it was. And that year, they built an extra stage. The Rebbe was already turning 80 years old, and they built, so there was a second stage. There's another 3 steps going up. And actually, the 3 steps happened to be here in Toronto. They happened to be in somebody's garage here in Toronto now. So that's another story. But and I remember coming to Shul at Mincha, and I see the steps. I'm like, he's not going to get in the chair today. And I remember being so disappointed. So the Rebbe would climb up the steps, and everybody was able to see him. The whole 770 was very high up, but he wasn't on the chair anymore. So what this story proves to me and should prove to you is that we may not remember what happens from year to year as a child, right? I definitely was not a stupid child. I don't know if I was the smartest kid, but definitely wasn't stupid. Right? I'm clever enough to ask questions, to remember things. I didn't remember.
Does this child have an age?
That's a very good, Eliezer, that's an excellent question. Does the child have an age? My answer to you would be, as long as the child is able to ask questions, that's great. That's what we want. How old is that? I don't know. Some kids are speaking at 2 or 3, and some children are speaking at 5 or 6. It doesn't give him an age because it's not about an age, it's about an ability.
A child you call up to the bar mitzvah.
Yes, a child is called a child up to his bar mitzvah. And these days in Canada, till he's 37. But, that's the question is not what is legally called a child or technically called a child. Obviously, if you have a baby and the baby is 3 months old and you bring the baby to the table and you're like, ask the question, then the person should have his head examined. That's not normal, right? Like that, obviously, that's not normal.
So it could be taken as a child metaphorically?
No.
Innocent, or we're talking about a young
No, this is clearly not talking about a person who's young and innocent. This is clearly talking about a child. The Mishnah is not a book of metaphor, it's a book of rules and regulations. And rules and regulations have to speak in a language of rules and regulation. Does this have other meanings? Could it contain meanings that are beyond the literal meaning? Sure, yeah, of course it can. But it has to first and foremost be literal because it's a book of law. It's not a book of homily, it's not a book of sermons.
So we'll wait to then what happens if there's no child?
Yeah, well, we're going to see in a minute what happens to the child. It's just the next line. But my point is, the child may not remember what happened last year, Pesach. In fact, he probably doesn't remember it at a certain point, whether the child is 5 or the child is 6, the child is 7. But the child does remember what happened last Friday night. Because at the most, last Friday night was a week ago. At the most. Like this year, it's going to be a full week later. Okay, actually a day later this year. Because Friday night is like, Motzei Shabbos is his first Seder. It'll be a day ago. But it could be a week. It could be a week ago. The child remembers what happened. And I just want to give you just a parenthetical little note over here. We're talking about a perfect situation where the child is living a Yiddishkeit life. Obviously, if a child showed up at a Seder and the parents never have a Friday night dinner, of course the child's not going to be able to ask any questions. He doesn't know anything. He's a total ignoramus. So the child has to have experiences, then he can ask questions. Many years ago, the fellow came to buy a mezuzah. On Friday morning. Okay, fine. I said, did you put on tefillin today? No, I didn't really do that. I said, I know, but you're here already. Let's put on tefillin. Okay. So he bought his mezuzah, and he put on tefillin, and he started crying. I saw he was very shaken. So I said, are you okay? He said, yeah. I was like embarrassed at his emotional outburst. I'm fine. I said, but you seem to be very unhappy. So he confided in me, opened up. He said, I'm an exchange student. I'm here from Israel, and I'm in York University. And York University already, 15 years ago, was a hotbed of anti-Semitism. Today it's infinitely worse. And he said, I'm really uncomfortable. I never felt so, like, almost singled out of my life. And he said, that's why I came to buy a mezuzah. I think today, a person like that wouldn't have the guts to buy a mezuzah. He'd be terrified to buy a mezuzah, unfortunately. But then he said, I feel like I need a mezuzah. I feel overwhelmed, and I feel animosity around me. I feel I need to have something Jewish. So that's why I came here. So I said, do you have anywhere to be tonight for Sudat Shabbat? He said to me, no. I said, would you like to join us for Sudat Shabbat? He said, I would love that. Fine. Davening is whatever time it was. And he showed up to davening. And we sit down to Friday night dinner. We come home, sing Shalom Aleichem. Okay, sing Shalom Aleichem. And then I'm making Kiddush. He says, it's not Rosh Hashanah tonight. And it's not Pesach. So I said, no, it's not, it's Shabbat. He says, you make Kiddush on Shabbat? Imagine, boy grew up in Tel Aviv his whole life. I said, yeah. He says, wow, I never saw this on a Friday night. He said, only if we used to go to my grandfather who lives in Katamon. I saw this on Rosh Hashanah for dinner and on Pesach. I didn't know you make Kiddush on Friday night. How sad is this? A boy grew up in Israel. Okay. So then we sit down, challah. It was braided challah. And he says, it's not round challah? I said, no. He said, isn't challah supposed to be round? I said, on Rosh Hashanah, challah's round. during the year, it's braided. I never saw braided challah in my life, he told me. A boy growing up in Tel Aviv, I never saw braided challah. I never sat down at a table. I thought challah was pretty ubiquitous. He never saw braided challah. And all the things that happened that night, I wanted to know where the honey was. Because on the Seder night, we have no salt. And then on Rosh Hashanah night, we have honey. And here we're dipping in. I never saw that. And then the gefilte fish came out. He says, wow, this is mamash Rosh Hashanah. I said, no. And then chicken soup came out, and there was meat, matzah balls, and this is like Pesach, right? So obviously, a kid like this, he was asking questions, but that's like a backward situation. That's like a situation where he wasn't a kid, he was in his mid-20s, where somebody had never seen a Friday night table. That's obviously not the way we should be raising our children. A child like that could never ask a question on a Seder night because he never saw anything else.
But he's asking because he notices a difference.
Very good. But that's exactly the point. So if you are a child growing up in a normal situation, what is normal? So I'm going to say, from a Torah perspective, normal is that a child's getting a Torah education. So a child's growing up in a normal Torah education. What happens every Friday night? There's Kiddush, there's Challah, there's a meal. And all of a sudden it's Yom Tov night, and the child doesn't remember what happened last year. He doesn't remember, because that was last year. But he remembers what happened last week, and 2 weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago, and last month, and maybe 2 months ago, and all of a sudden there's a pattern that's established, and children like things that are comfortable, because that's the nature of children. They don't like surprises. And everything is like just strange. It's kind of familiar, but it's different. The bread is different. The table looks different. We're dipping things. There's like funny things going on. Now we didn't even eat, and we're pouring another cup of wine. What's going on here? So the child at this moment bursts out in a question. You see, like it's brilliantly designed. It's designed to get the child to ask the question. So the Brisa says, Chacham b'noi, if he's a clever child, so then Shoyle, he's going to ask. Well, what happens if the child, despite your efforts, doesn't ask the question? He doesn't ask the question. I don't know why. He's not clever. He doesn't put two and two together. You know, like the kid in the class, so Nebuch, all the kids know where to put the triangle in the triangle, and the circle in the circle, and the square in the square, you know, like at the nursery school. And usually there's like a few kids who are having a hard time with it. They're putting the circle in the square. They don't know why it doesn't fit. They don't know. Okay, so you work with them. You try to teach them patterns. And the kid doesn't know. Okay, he's not a kind of kid to ask questions. And you're exploding. Could you just ask the question? And the kid is like, what's the problem? So he's not asking the question. So in that case, says the Brisa, and this is like self-understood if the child wouldn't be there. But here the point I think is being made is the child is there, but the child's not asking. So do you say, okay, we're not going further until you ask a question? The answer is no, because then he's not asking a question. Then he's just feeding him words. And that's not actually how it's supposed to be. So Meini Chacham, if he's not clever enough to ask the question, which tells us that, feeding the kid the question is not the only thing that's coming. Ishte Sha'alte, then the wife should ask. We're assuming this is sitting together, they're sitting alone. So let the wife ask the question. So she asks her husband, the husband responds. And what if he has no wife? And what if he's sitting alone? Unfortunately, a few years ago, thousands of Jews were alone on the Seder night. It's very sad. COVID, people couldn't go out. So what do you do then? So the Brisa says, Hu shoyel la'atzmai. He asks himself the questions. Asks himself. People ask themselves questions sometimes. You start to stimulate the conversation. You start to think about questions. So here you verbalize. You ask yourself the questions. So like, okay, so what are we doing here tonight? Why am I sitting here tonight all alone? And I made this whole Seder. Who did I make it for? What am I doing here? Why is this important tonight? What makes tonight different than any other night? It's a fair question to ask. And start to talk to yourself. Nobody to talk to yourself. And the Gemara says, Afilu shnei talmidei chachamim. Even if you have two very, very learned, literate Jews, and Yedin, they know Hilchos Pesach, they know the answers also. Not only they know the questions, they know the answers also. So what should you do? And like, what will be the point? He doesn't have to think about the answers. He knows it. They all know everything already. Nonetheless, shoyalin zeh lazeh. They should ask a question to one another. So what did the Brisa do for us? The Gemara, this is an unusual Gemara because the Gemara didn't ask a question about the Mishnah. The Gemara simply contrasted the teaching of the Mishnah, which told us when the child asked the question. The Gemara contrasted this with the idea that it's important for a question to be asked. It's important for a question to be asked.
I just missed you. What is this question? The Manishtana?
Yeah, the Manishtana. Yeah. That's what we're going to go. The Gemara is going to go a little further. We're going to see what the question is. So the question that I'm going to put out to you is, the question I'll ask you on the question is, why is it so important to ask the question? If your child asks a question, great. I'm glad the child is asking a question. Answer the question. If a child doesn't answer the question, like why does somebody have to ask a question? But clearly, the Bryce is telling us somebody has to ask a question.
It's it's an important part of intellect that I'm growing up to be comfortable to ask questions.
You make an excellent point, Doctor. It is important for a person to be comfortable asking questions. It's the way we have to encourage questions, not sarcastic questions, and not mockery questions, which is what some people think is important. That's not cute. That's not funny. It's not nice. It's not respectful. But real questions, good questions. Yeah, we should encourage people to ask questions because, like the Mishna says, lo yahabaishan lomed. That's very nice. But what does it have to do with Pesach Night? That's a general concept that you should encourage questions. Say that I encourage questions. Should encourage questions, especially with your children. And in general, people should encourage questions. If people won't ask, how will they learn? But is that how it has to begin? Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. So sometimes I speak to younger people. So I speak to high school kids. Sometimes I speak to non-Jewish kids in the Catholic schools, and I try to get them to ask questions because then it's not just a monologue. Then they're more involved. But it doesn't always work that way. Oftentimes, I'll say, anybody have any questions? And they just give me blank stares. I'm like, wow, you know everything there is to know? Like you have nothing, you're curious about anything? Nobody's curious. Okay, fine. So then I have to start off. It's easier for me also if somebody asks a question. You ask a question, I give an answer. It's much harder if I have to start off. But the truth is that education is not necessarily about asking questions only. Would there be wisdom tonight to sit down? Okay, everybody, it's a Gemara class, ask questions. No, first we have to learn something. You can't ask questions if you don't learn something. So, and what does it have to do with Pesach Night? This is not a commentary on education. This is about the mitzvah of Pesach Night. Now, I want to read to you from the Rambam's book of mitzvahs, because the Rambam's book of mitzvahs is a fantastic source for understanding what a mitzvah is. The Rambam in the book of mitzvahs doesn't give us rules and regulations. He gives us the actual mahut ha-mitzvah. What is the mitzvah? The definition of the mitzvah. So the Rambam in the book of mitzvahs, mitzvah number 157 says, we were commanded by God, l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim, to tell the story on the night of the 15th of Nisan. And by the way, not in the middle of the night, but it has to be B'tchilat halayla, from when night falls. Not before night falls, when night falls. And how much or well does a person have to tell the story? Says the Rambam, the mitzvah is kefi tzachut lashon hamasaper. It's about the teller, as well as the teller can. So we have a mitzvah to tell, v'chol ma sheyosif l'saper, and the more you tell the story, ula ha'arich b'dvarim, the more you elaborate these things, b'hagdalat ma she'asa lanu Hashem, by magnifying your knowledge of and appreciation for what God did for us, the bigger the mitzvah. The bigger the mitzvah. Now later on, the Rambam says that the Mechilta tells us, v'higada televincha, you should tell your child a story. And the old Mechilta, the verse also says, v'hayaki yishal chavincha. So later on in this entry, the Rambam says, Yochel, you might think, and he's quoting here from the Mechilta, im sho'alcha, yishalcha, if he asks you, so then, atamagadli, then you answer. If you ask the question, I'll answer you. Im lav, ein atamagadli. If he doesn't ask questions, you're not going to tell him. Says the Rambam, Talmud leima v'igata levincha. You have to tell your child. Beino lebein acherim minayim. How do you know that this is the case if he's sitting with others? Beino lebein atzmo. Sorry, I skipped the line. Ein li el bezman sheyesh leben. This only tells me when he has a child. Because it says v'igata levincha. Tell your child. What if I have no child? So then in that case, beino lebein atzmo, sitting by himself, or he's sitting with others, how do you know? So he says, Talmud Lomar, because Moshe Rabbeinu says, Zachor et hayom hazeh. I want you to remember this day. That's talking about the Exodus. And the Rambam says, in other words, Tziva lezochro, he commanded us to remember it, Kemosha Amar, as he said, Zachor et yom hashabbat lekadsho. Just the same way he said to remember Shabbat. Now this is a unique expression from the Rambam. What the Rambam means is mitzvah 155 is the mitzvah of lekadesh haShabbat, to sanctify Shabbat. And how does one sanctify the Shabbat? The Rambam says, Lomar devarim. You should say words. Use your words. Verbalize. When Shabbat arrives and when Shabbat leaves, Shebohem, with these words, Nazkir Gedulat Yom Zeh. We will remember and be mindful of the greatness of this day. So the Rambam is very clear in defining the mitzvah. He says the mitzvah doesn't need any questions. The mitzvah is to tell the story. The mitzvah is to verbalize. That's the mitzvah. So why do we have this brisa? And this is the way the Gemara wants us to understand the Mishnah, that we have to stimulate the question, get the child to ask. The child's not going to ask, let the wife ask. Talk to yourself. Get somebody else to. People should ask each other. It has to be in a question answer. Why? What's behind this? And very interesting, Rashi says nothing about this. Rashi doesn't say it all. And even Rashbam doesn't say anything. So to be sure, and I mentioned this in the previous episode, I'm going to mention it again. There is the responsa of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher is the third and the youngest of the major codifiers of halacha. We have the Alphas, who is the senior, the elder codifier, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi of North Africa. We have the Rambam of Spain and later Egypt, Maimonides. And then we have Rabbeinu Asher, originally from the Germanic provinces, but eventually settles in Spain. And then he writes codes, codifies the Talmudic ideas and concepts in a systematic class of rulings. But the Rosh also wrote responsa, which means he received questions and he responded to questions. By the way, the Rambam also has books of responsa. Responsa is in Hebrew is called Sha'alot or Tshuvot. Questions were asked and questions were answered. I get so many questions popping up here. The problem, I know. I'll tell you what the problem with all these questions is. Some of the questions are just like cute comments, so thank you very much. I'm glad that people are commenting. But some of the questions don't directly link to what we're learning. both are older, both ask. If child or wife, only child or wife ask. Well, it sounds that somebody has to ask. That's what it sounds like here. It doesn't say both have to ask. It says somebody has to ask and somebody has to answer. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like. And really,
There's only a mother and a son.
a mother and a son? That's a good question. Who would be the primary teller? So there's a discussion, and the Rebbe brings this down in his commentary in the Haggadah, if a woman is obligated in telling the story biblically or only rabbinically. Because it's a mitzvah shazman grama. It's a positive mitzvah, which is time-bound. And because it's a positive mitzvah, which is time-bound, there are other things like that. For example, to dwell in the sukkah also reminds of Hashem's miracles. And over there, a woman is not obligated. So there's two opinions, two schools of thought. And because of two schools of thought, probably it's better if she asks and he tells, assuming he's bar mitzvah. But even if they're both senior people and both fully responsible, one has to ask and one has to answer. So the Rosh has a very interesting, he got these different questions that he responded to. This is found in Klal 24, subsection 2. It's a whole section that deals with the holidays. It deals with Pesach, Chometz, and Matzah, and Haggadah, the cups of wine, Sfirat HaOmer, talks about Shofar, Sukkah, Lulav, Hadas, Passover, and Sukkot, basically. So he says, you asked, why don't we make a blessing on this mitzvah? He says, we don't make a blessing on this mitzvah because there are a lot of things the ultimate goal of the mitzvah is that we should remember. And the reason we're doing it is that we should remember. That's what it's about. And when we do these things, then we will remember. When is the mitzvah fulfilled? When you have the remembrance, when you remember. So he says, therefore, the things we do on the Pesach night is so we should remember. But the Rosh says something very surprising. He says, Lav dafka haggadah b'peh. Even though we just read from the Rambam says that he must be a verbalization. The Rosh is of the opinion that it doesn't have to be haggadah b'peh. Rather, he said, im yishal mafrishenloi. If somebody asks the question, then you have to answer. If you don't ask the question, well, you're eating matzah, you're drinking wine, you're scanning or reading the Haggadah. But if you read the Haggadah in English, you didn't say anything. Did you fulfill the mitzvah? The Rosh would say there's no mitzvah. The mitzvah of verbalization is only when you have somebody else to talk to, because but somebody else can't read your mind. But if you're by yourself, just read the Haggadah, just read it, as people would say in English, just to read. To read doesn't mean to read out loud, to read with your eyes. Like in a library, people read. So that's what the Rosh says. That's the opinion of the Rosh. And it's a surprising opinion. It's definitely not what the Rambam says. And I talked about this in the previous episode. So the Rabbeinu Yerucham Fishel Perlov, who wrote this unbelievable commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvahs of Reb Saadia Gaon, so in Mitzvah 33, he says that it's clear from the Rosh that there is no mitzvah of verbalizing the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim el al pi she'elat haben, only if the child asks, because that's what the Torah says. Ki yishalcha bincha. That's what the Torah says. It's clear that the Rambam holds chacham b'nai, if his son is clever, she'ela, he asks the question. And then if not, his wife asks, he asks himself. So, 1 second. But the mitzvah is only if your child asked. So, Rabbi Yerucham says that would only be midrabanan. That's only a rabbinic mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah. The rabbi said, because the Torah instituted that it should be by virtue of a child asking, but because it should be by virtue of asking, so therefore the rabbis, the sages, the Rabbanan instituted that the story should be told in a manner of questioning and answering, a Q&A. Avo midiraisa, he says, but if you look at it from a pure biblical perspective, vaday lekach yuva. There's no obligation here. The obligation is lahashav laben. You get a question, you have to answer it. And you better do your homework. You better have what to answer. But you get a question, you answer it. Now, not every question has to be answered. If somebody asks a question, not because they want an answer. I'm not talking about Pesach Night. I'm saying in general. Somebody asks a question because they want to ask questions. You don't have to answer that question. I don't answer every question that people ask me. Sometimes I size up a situation and I see the person is being sarcastic or worse. I'm not going to respond. Sometimes it's best not to respond. I learned a long, long time ago that just because the media asks a question doesn't mean I have to respond. So they'll threaten you. If you don't respond, we'll say you were not available for comment. Say whatever you want. Do what you have to do. Why would I do that? Because I had enough dealings with the media. And oftentimes they'll twist your words. Whatever you're going to say, you'll turn you into the village idiot. They'll feed you quotes or quote something you said out of context. And you're best off sometimes just being, you weren't available for comment. Even though it doesn't always sound great. And you always have to you look at your options. I'm just saying, not every question that a person poses necessarily has to be answered. There are questions that are asked for the wrong reasons. But on the night of Pesach, the question has to be answered. And even if the child is a wicked child, a ben harasha, he also asks the questions. We also answer him. We answer him an answer that's appropriate for him. But on Pesach night, even if he asks in a sneering, sarcastic way, we have an obligation to answer. That's what's unique about this night. And that's when you have a mitzvah to speak. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yerucham as he explains the Rosh. He says that's the opinion of the Rosh. So what about when the Torah says that at psachle, she'eni der lishlat psachle, shenemer v'yigadto levincha. V'yigadto levincha doesn't say the child asked the question. It says v'yigadto, you have to tell, you have to take the initiative of telling. So Rabbi Yerucham says that would have to be what's called an asmachta. It doesn't clearly say it in the Torah. Sometimes the Chachamim will say something and they will borrow a phrase in the Torah to buttress their approach. So this is an asmachta. It's used to prove a point, or it buttresses and it makes a point more well-founded, but it's not an actual biblical obligation. So that's what the Rosh, that has to be. Rabbi Yerucham doesn't say that's his halachic opinion, but he said that would be the opinion of the Rosh. The opinion of the Rosh. And it's interesting that this would mean, the Rambam quoted a Mechilta. How do you work this out? So the Rebbe in the Haggadah says that there are actually two versions in the Mechilta. One version of the Mechilta could be understood the way the Rosh understands it, and the other version of the Mechilta sounds more like the Rambam is saying. There's two versions. We don't have clarity. We have two versions, and the Rishonim took one school of thought or the other. Now, incidentally, this is not a little point. This is a major point, because we are not only obligated to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach. In fact, we're obligated to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim every single day of our lives. Here's the Rambam of the beginning of Krishma. It happens to be today's Rambam. The Rambam says in the first Perek of Hilchos Krishma, the Rambam says, mitzvah lahazker Yetzias Mitzrayim balayla ubayom. It's a mitzvah. Shenemer l'man tizkor yom tzeischem eretz Mitzrayim. Kol yemei chayecha. So because that's the case, when you read the third portion of Shema, even though it's about tzitzit, and there's a discussion of whether or not this has to be read at night, it has to be read because there is a mention of Yetziat Mitzrayim. In that case, what makes the night of Pesach special or unique? It's a good question. The Rebbe actually asked this question. The Rebbe in the commentary of the Haggadah, the Rebbe says, "Va'af shemitzvah v'natera lahasker Yetzias Mitzrayim b'chol yom v'chol laila," as the Gemara says in Brachos and Daf Yud Beis, and as the Rambam says in the Laws of Krishma, the first chapter, Halacha Gimel, and the Alter Rebbe says the same thing in the beginning of chapter 67 of the Orach Chaim section of Shulchan Aruch. So the Rebbe says, "Yesh lechalek beinehem," there could be differences between v'gam mid'oraisa, and the Rebbe says 6 differences between every night of the year and between the night of Pesach. So the first difference he makes is that on a regular night of the year, if you think about Yetzias Mitzrayim and you didn't verbalize Yetzias Mitzrayim, you still would have fulfilled the mitzvah. But on the night of Pesach, it has to be verbalized. It has to be b'dibur dafka. Now, of course, Rabbeinu Asher does not seem to agree with that. That's not the opinion of Rabbeinu Asher. But many, many, many other, the Rebbe cites a whole slew of Rishonim that emphasize, like we just saw in the Rambam, that it has to be verbalized. Second answer that Rebbe gives is that every single night of the year, a zechira, a bare mention is good enough. The Rambam's words are, He doesn't say mitzvah lasaper. He says mitzvah lahazkir. Mitzvah lahazkir, he says, right? He says mitzvah lahazkir, to mention. A mention is not the same as a sipur. On the night of Pesach, it's a mitzvah to tell the story. It's a big difference. Mentioning something takes a moment. Telling a story takes time. A third answer is, and this the Rebbe says, will follow the approach of the Rosh, that there is the opinion that it's only if a question is asked. And it has to be in the manner of question and answer. And here's where it gets very interesting. The Rebbe cites a whole slew of different opinions, and I'm not going to go into different sources. But it seems clear from what the Rebbe says that there's one possibility learning this the way the Rosh learns it, that only if there was a question asked, only then is there a biblical responsibility. But there seems to be another school of thought in that the way that the story should be told on the night of Pesach is in a way of questions and answers. So obviously, because the Torah says Ki yisholcha bincha, and the first responsibility is teaching the next generation, if the child is wise and clever, that would be the best thing to have. What if it's not a wise or clever child? Then somebody else should ask the question. So his wife will ask the question. He'll talk to himself. On a regular night of the year, you don't have to ask questions. Why am I Jewish? Oh, I'm Jewish because God took us out of Mitzrayim. But on the night of Pesach, you have to be in a manner of question and answer. And the Torah emphasizes the idea of questions. And then the Rebbe gives a whole bunch of other answers. I'm not going to go into that. But my point here is when we're learning this Gemara, and the Gemara says, Chacham b'nai, if his child is clever, shoyli, v'meini chacham ishte shalte, it's very clear that this mitzvah necessitates questions and answers. Now, how would the Rosh learn this Gemara? How would the Rosh learn the Gemara? Because even if the Rosh had a different version of the Mechilta, how would the Rosh learn the Gemara? So I would tell you that the Rosh will learn the Gemara the way Rabbi Yerucham Fischel said he learns the Gemara. He says that this is not biblical but rabbinic. The rabbinic way to do this mitzvah is that the biblical way is if the child asked. If there's no child, or there's no child to ask, the child's not clever enough to ask, somebody else should ask the question. That's the way the Chachamim wanted it to be. Why? Because that's the way it is in the Torah. And the Chachamim always patterned things after the way the method that the Torah gave it us. So if you don't have a hand, you can't put on tefillin. Okay? You don't have a child to ask a question, so you can't do this mitzvah. That mitzvah is not obligatory, biblically. But rabbinically, it is still obligatory, according to the Rosh. So how would it be? In the same way that it's applicable biblically. Somebody asked a question, somebody gave an answer. Now we understand why the Mishnah was so insistent on doing funny things, telling us we have to do these funny things to provoke the questions. If you look at it in the Rosh's way, if you're not going to get the child to ask questions, you're missing a biblical mitzvah. You're only getting a rabbinic mitzvah. And even if you don't look at it in the Rosh's way, and you say that the mitzvah has to be done in a manner of question and answer, but if you want to follow the stricture of the Torah stricture is, Ki yisholcha bincha. So obviously that's going to be the best way to do this mitzvah. So it's understood now by virtue of this brisa, we can understand why the Mishnah has this whole setup. And all we're trying to do is get the kid to just ask, which is the name of tonight's class. Just ask. Would you ask already? And the kid's like looking at you. I don't know. Yiddish, British, I don't know what you're talking about.
This is every year the same problem.
Well, hopefully the child gets a little more clever from year to year, like he asks better questions.
It's dangerous because we're often asking robotically, like, okay, it's Pesach. Who's the youngest? Who's going to ask 4 questions? They're not asking
There is an element of robotics here, which is not positive.
So
But I'll
responsibility on the one who's leading the Seder to change that.
absolutely, it's absolutely necessary. And I have colleagues who go out of their way to do a lot of funny things at the Seder to really stimulate the children's interest. Like they buy little frogs and throw them on the table, or whatever. Like I didn't grow up that way, and to me it still seems strange. But even if it's not so robotic, I have to tell you that having grown up in a family and as a child being with grandparents, and then having Baruch Hashem my own children now, or even my own grandchildren, my grandchildren aren't asking maybe this year they'll ask the question for the first time, but it's an engaging thing. It's the kids have to ask the question, and I remember as a child being frustrated. I didn't get an answer to my question. And it's like I remember one year I said to my father, "You didn't answer my question. You told me a story," and my father had to explain to me that The point is not these questions. The point is, why are we doing these things differently? And the answer is, because there's a story to tell. I said, I didn't get that. So as much as it was robotic, it wasn't robotic. And in general, when it comes to mitzvahs, there's always the danger of robotics, which is not the way we're supposed to do a mitzvah. So this is what's behind. This is what's behind this. Now, incidentally, if you look in the Code of Jewish Law, in the Shulchan Aruch, it simply says, it repeats this brisa verbatim, right? So, for example, if you go to the Torah says, Umoizgin loy, this is in Siman Tov Ayin Gimel, the Torah says, Umoizgin miyad kreis sheni, and the Torah adds the words, Kidei sheyishal hatinek. You pour the second cup in order for the child. So the Mishnah just said v'chan haben, but the Torah adds the word Moizgin kreis sheni kidei sheyishal hatinek. Lama sheisin kreis sheni. Why are we eating a second cup before the Suda? In other words, he's very clear. We stimulate the question. V'im ein chochma beben lishal. He doesn't want to say the child is not wise. So what if the child doesn't have the wisdom? He does not clever enough to, doesn't clue in. Then that could aviv malamde, which the Gemara didn't say, by the way. Then the father has to get him, teach him to ask the question, point out what's wrong. V'im ein loy ben, if he doesn't have a child there. So and we can learn, understand the Torah in different ways. Either aviv malamde, because he wants to fulfill the biblical mitzvah. Maybe the Torah held like his father, like the Rosh. Or, even if we don't say that he held the halacha like his father, aviv malamde, because that's the ideal way for this mitzvah to be done. The ideal way is a child asking. And what if there is no child asking? So, mainly ben, ishto she'alte. V'im lav, hu she'elas atzmei. V'afilu shnei talmid chachamim, even they have two talmid chachamim, habikiyim, be'ilchos Pesach, she'elim zelz, they ask one another, manishtana. So this is how the Torah, the Torah...
Each one asking the question? Or?
Yeah, the role play. You ask the question, I ask the question. There's a question and answer going on. There's it's dynamic. There's question and answer. So, it's interesting that in this is quoted also in the Big Shulchan Aruch. The Rabbi Yosef Karo says, Moizgin loy miyad, immediately pour a second glass. Kedei adds the word miyad. You see how each one adds another. He adds the word miyad immediately. Kedei sheyishal atinekes, the children. He went plural now. He says the children should be asking. And really, all the children at the tables, at the Seder table, should be asking this question. Lama sheisim kreis sheni. Why are we drinking a second cup? Kreidim suda, before we had a meal. Mein chachma ben aviv malamde. A father teach him. In mainly Ben doesn't have a child. Ishtay, the wife will ask. And if you have wise people, then they ask each other. So this is the opening volley of that's the first part of the Gemara. Now the Gemara asks a question about the question, one of the questions in the Gemara. The first question in the Mishna is, all the nights we're eating chametz u'matzah, but tonight we're eating only matzah. Because there's crackers on the table sometimes, but there's no bread. And it's only crackers on the table. It's what's going on over. What's with the wafers? Every single year there's all kinds of vegetables on the table. There's salad, sweet vegetables, bitter vegetables. Tonight all we get is bitter stuff. We're eating roasted meat and other kinds of meat and cooked meat. Tonight everything's only roasted. That's in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. And then the last question is that ein anu chayovim litboil afilu pamachas. We don't have the obligation of dipping even once. And halayla hazeh, on this night, shtei pamim. That's what the Mishnah said. That was the end of the Mishnah that we learned previously. So the Gemara asks a question now. Maskif l'Rava. Rava asks questions. Well, I don't understand this question. And you'll see how understanding this question is going to edify our understanding of the business of asking questions. He says, Otu kol yoma lo sagi de lo mitavla chodazimna. What is this? You mean Every night of the year, we have to dip something once. Tonight, we have to dip it twice. Really? Do you always have to dip something? I understand French fries are dipped in ketchup, and fish and chips are dipped in whatever it's called, the mayonnaise sauce. But like, do you always dip? If you have to dip? I mean, what's some kind of halacha? You have to dip? Chayavim? So here the Rashbam chimes in and he says, "Oto kol yom sagid lemitavlinan." The katani we learn shabachal haleiles anu matbilin pamachas. Every night we dip at least once. Well, you can only dip once. Only French fries and ketchup, and not schnitzel and mustard. Avol ashabachal haleiles anu eichlem shayirokes lekal mifrach. You can't say, well, other nights we eat other kinds of vegetables. The hasam hachikamar b'chol haleiles. A whole year, we're not looking for bitter herbs. There may be bitter herbs, but we're not focused on bitter herbs. Tonight, all I see is you focusing on bitter herbs. Why is this singular focus on the bitter herbs? That's the question. So that's a reasonable question. But what kind of question is this? Every night we have to dip it once, and now we're dipping twice. And the Gemara seems to understand like a deeper question. And the deeper question is this. Amar Rava says, Hachi Ketani, B'chol ha'leiles einanu chayavim litpil afilu pamachas. Don't read it every night of the year. You have to dip once. You don't have to dip at all. Einanu chayavim litpil afilu. He's adding the word afilu. So he's like augmenting, explaining the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say you have to. The Mishnah says you don't have to dip even once. But halayla hazeh, this night, you have to dip shnei pa'im. You have to dip 2 times. So the Gemara says, Rav Safa says to Rava, 1 second. Okay, so you resolved this business that you don't have to dip anything on the first night, the big dip. But now we're going to double dip. He says, this double dip is an obligation? It's an obligation, he says? Maskeflo Rav Safa, chiyuva. It's an obligation to dip? It's not an obligation. It's ledardiki. You only dip for the children. You're provoking the question. It's not an obligation. It's maybe leading into a mitzvah. You're not dipping because there's value in the dipping itself. The dipping is merely a means to an end. It's supposed to stimulate curiosity and get the child to ask the question. Rashbam explains. Chova ledardiki. You have to read this with an exclamation mark because the Gemara doesn't have punctuation. He says bitmiya, with like an amazement, like astonished. Hamishum hekeda de tinaikes. We're only doing this so that the children should notice something is different. The only reason that we have to wash our hands is because we are going to be dipping something in liquid. And when you dip a vegetable in liquid, there is a halachic basis to washing your hands before. The point is we want the child to see that everything looks like a regular night. We made kiddush, we wash our hands, and no, we didn't eat the bread. Instead, we dipped the vegetable. So the dipping is what makes him ask the question. And then you start pouring the second cup of wine after you broke the bread, broke the matzah, didn't eat it, and then you're pouring more wine. That the kid plots it at this point. And this is all kidei sheyishalu. So in order he should ask this question kavdinan. So Yitzi's asking the child seems to know what happened before it happened. That's a famous question. The child didn't see the double dip yet, but the child could be told that the mortar is going to be dipped in the charoset. And really, the child might ask, what is this? It might find out that it's going to be dipped in the charoset. And by the way, the dipping in the charoset is an obligation to kill certain germs. We talked about that in the previous Gemara class. So that's like that is obligatory. The dipping of the mortar in the charoset is obligatory, but the dipping of the karpas, of the vegetable, in salt water is not obligatory. I mean, in a manner of speaking, there's no mitzvah to have something dipped in salt water. Although, of course, it has meaning and so on and so forth. So the Gemara says, so what's going on over here? It's not an obligation. Ella Omar Rav Safar says, Hachi Ketani. Don't read the Mishnah as Chayovim, tonight we are obligated. Instead, read the Mishnah as Ein Anu Matbilin. We don't dip afilu pa'amachas. Halayla hazeh shtei pa'amim. All the nights of the year we don't necessarily dip even once. And tonight we double dip. So the child is not saying Chayovim, the child is merely mentioning the matter of fact that there is a dipping going on. Now, it's interesting, in the Shulchan Aruch itself, we don't have the text of the Banashtana. It's not in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, it's not there. However, if you take a look in the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, that's where we do have this. And interestingly, in the codes that were written by the drawing a blank now. By the Levush. In the codes written by the Levush, he does speak a little bit about the language. He gives us the language of the Banashtana, and he says, "V'tzarich sheyomer," he has to say, "Shebachol haleilot ein anu matbilin afilu pa'am achat." All the nights of the year we don't dip even once. However, halayla hazeh shtei pamim, tonight twice. Pirusho, this is the Levush, the Mordechai Yafe. He wrote something like around the time of the Shulchan Aruch, along the same system of the Torah, but it's called the Levushim. So the Baal Levushim says, what does it mean that we have to dip? Pirusho b'chol haleilot ein anu nohagim. It's not customary. Afilu pa'amachat. But halayla hazeh nohagin, it is our custom, it is our practice that we dip 2 times. Kelomar she'enu ela minhag. It's only a thing we do. And why do we do this? We do this kadei sheyishalu hatinokot, so that the children will ask. Aval ein lomar, we shouldn't say shebachol haleilot ein anu chayavim. We shouldn't say we are not obligated, or we are obligated, because it's not an obligation actually. That's the way Mordechai Yafe understands. That's how he understands the Gemara. And that's the resolution of the Gemara. It's very interesting. Rabbi Yaakov Mulin, the Maharil, in his Seder Haggadah, he says, in the name of Rabbeinu Simcha, he says, the children can't say Ein anu chayovim. The children have no obligation. Because we're doing it so the children ask the question. However, Gedolim shayach chiyuva. The adults do have an obligation. Their obligation is to do this to make the children ask the question. And this seems to be a source for the idea, by the way, that everybody should ask the questions of Banashtana, which is our custom. That after the children ask the question, everybody at the table asks the question. Challah and salt is not done on the night of the Seder. So the point here is, and also it's not the same kind of dipping. Dipping, you're going into a substance, you're going into salt water, you're going into charesis, it's not the same kind of dip. So the interesting thing is that the Maharil seems to say it is a bit of an obligation. It is a bit of an obligation. Now, in the commentary on the Levush, the Eliyahu Rabbah, he brings down the Maharil, and he says that even though the Maharil calls it a chiyuva, he says nonetheless, how do we understand the Gemara? The Gemara says otherwise. So the truth is, it's not so posh that the Gemara says otherwise, because the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Taf Ayin Gimel, he says, Tzarech lomar ein anu matbilin, aval ein lomar ein anu chayavim. Don't say we're not obligated, say we don't. How are you going to say halayla zeh shtei pa'amim? You're not obligated. Ein matbilim ach maschiyov elo pam achas. There's only one dipping which is obligatory. That's the dipping of maror and the bitter herbs and the charosat. However, dipping in the salt water is not obligatory, but it's done kedei lahatmiya hatinokot. But interestingly, later on in chapter 484, the Alter Rebbe speaks about what happens if somebody is like he's the only one in the village who knows anything about halacha. Nobody knows what to do. and I guess they couldn't make a public Seder. So he goes from house to house, and he's helping different people make a Seder. So the Alter Rebbe says he can make the brachas, even though he already finished his Seder, and now he can make the brachas for them. What about the bracha on the karpas? He's not going to eat, but they're going to eat. So usually, you can't just make a bracha for somebody. But here the Alter Rebbe says you could make the bracha. Why? He said it's not like a regular bracha of vegetable. It's kamo chova. It's like an obligation. Why is it like an obligation? Because the Chachamim ordained it. Why did they ordain it? So we should be able to be asking the questions. Once the Chachamim ordained to do this, so the children should be asking the questions, it doesn't become a bit of an obligation. It's not so simple. So it's not so pasha that there isn't like a... Interestingly enough, the Kaf HaChaim says clearly that even though there are those who want to say from the Maharil that the adults could say Chayavim, and nonetheless, and he cites Alter Rebbe also as in saying this, he says, "Ein lazuz medivra Torah v'achronim." Don't go away from the words of the Torah and Achronim. That's where it stays the way it is, and that's all. My point of that I'm sharing all this is the following. It is clear that the Chachamim made these injunctions because it's really important to get the questions asked. And whether we learn it like the Rosh, whether we learn it because that's the only way we can do a biblical mitzvah, instead of having just a rabbinic mitzvah, or whether we learn because this is the way the biblical mitzvah is supposed to be fulfilled in its ideal state, the point is that it was very important to get questions asked. And if you can't get the questions asked organically, then you have to ask them inorganically, or robotically, as you said. But this is the methodology through which we fulfill the mitzvah. Now, the Rambam doesn't say this in the book of mitzvahs. The Rambam does not seem to think seem to hold that that's actually an obligation of the mitzvah. But nobody can argue. The Rambam won't argue either that the Torah uses that kind of verbiage. And because the Torah uses that kind of verbiage, and the Torah uses that kind of scenario, it's self-understood that the best way to do the mitzvah would be in that fashion. Now you have a better understanding of what's going on at your Seder, and why it's so important for the questions to be asked. Toif. So that concludes tonight's episode, Just Ask. And with Hashem's help, not next week, but in 2 weeks, we will have a second episode on this Gemara. And there the Gemara will talk about the shameful beginnings and the glorious endings, which is going to be more about the methodology we employ in telling that story. And that will be the final commentary on this Mishnah. And hopefully, the more we learn Torah and the more we delve into the nuances and the jurisprudence and the legal theory and philosophy of how we do these mitzvahs, we develop a new appreciation for them, and so they won't be robotic. They'll be done with fervor, they're done with enthusiasm, they're done with deeper meaning. And we continue to hope and pray that Be'ezrat Hashem, this year, we will be asking the question about the roasted meat, right? Because Mashiach is going to come in Eretz Hashem, and we will have a Korban Pesach, God willing, in Yerushalayim Eir HaKodesh. May it be b'mheira ubi amenu. Amen. Thank you for joining online. Thank you for joining in person. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family, and let's continue to spread a message of Torah teaching around the whole wide world. Thanks for joining. Laila Tov. Bye-bye.